Well, welcome to the Katalyst Open Mic Series. This is the #1 place where technology thought leaders hang out and share real-world advice on various topics relevant to you, our listener. I'm Jesse White, your host for today, and I'm pleased to introduce Bob Gaines, one of our closest friends at Accume Partners. I've worked with Bob much over the years, and we've shared many successes together, been on a few late-night calls as well. And thanks for coming on the Open Mic today, Bob.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Now you live in the Twin Cities area, correct? You are way up near the Great Lakes, so to speak.
Indeed, I am.
Good. And your firm, you guys are headquartered out of Manhattan, but you have literally a broad consultancy across the U.S. and I know some more brick and mortar down in Texas, correct?
Correct. Yeah, we're coast to coast, all points in between. So we have clients in Maine to Alaska, down to Florida, and up my neck of the woods. So we've got all points covered.
Great. Good to know. Now, you guys kind of started Accume in general. Again, we've done lots of work with you guys over the years, but you guys kind of broke out of another group. I know part of that original organization, Kevin Prince over at Stratas, and he's going to come on the show here before too long. He doesn't know that yet. But we do, some work with those guys too on the managed security side. And then you guys started Accume really to focus on helping organizations kind of build governance practices, right? Understand their risk and those sorts of things. But tell us a little bit about what Accume does today for our shared clients.
Sure. So actually, Accume's actually been around for 25 years. But They were bought by the previous owner of CompuShare, where I worked for 4 years. We're also Kevin and friends worked as well. And then I rejoined them when my security team essentially was forklifted from one company to another with the change in management. But our specialty really is, regulatory compliance, security, risk assessments, making sure that, our clients are protected against, all the various regulatory needs, as well as security, risk, and technology. So, but definitely it's a small interconnected world that we live in.
It is. It's almost incestuous, so to speak. Well, I'm excited about our time together today and bringing what I think are some really relevant topics and some of the ones that we see a lot of organizations struggle with. And so from time to time, we pull you in to help with these specific things, but really wanted to focus today around just cybersecurity, privacy, risk in general. There's a lot of organizations that are just starting out programs and looking to mature those things. But this is your first time on the show, and again, thanks for coming on. We always cover some relevant, current events, and I get to put my audience on the spot and ask questions about these things. So I'm excited to put you on the spot today. So sure. One of the things that's fascinating to me is if you look at just sort of the kind of breach awareness and the numbers that Panamon and Verizon put out and those sorts of things. But Security Magazine this week actually published, and I'm citing their article here, saying that the number of records exposed in Q1 for 2020 skyrocketed to 8.4 billion. That's a 273% increase compared to Q1 in 2019. And according to their risk-based security report, there's just been an explosion there. So similarly, as I asked many teachers, do you think the students that are coming into the organizations, to the universities, are getting smarter or not? I'd ask you the same question. Do you feel like organizations are getting better, or are bad actors better than we are in that capacity? What are your thoughts there?
It's a little bit of mixed. I think to some degree, most organizations are getting better. There's more technical solutions out there to stop, the low-hanging fruit, some of the really poor phishing attempts, a lot of attacks of perimeters. We're seeing less effective DDoS stuff. So I think to some degree, they're making some good choices, some good investments. I think people are getting a little bit better. But the issue is the crooks are just light speed ahead. It's like, junior high school track versus, the Olympics. The bad guys have the technology, they got the resources, and they have, more importantly, the incentive. It's so easy to make money for these guys by churning out viruses and trying to, trick people with social engineering attacks. So they have the motivation. And to some degree, they also have the ability to kind of, steal all the tools they need, whereas most businesses have to go out and buy investments to protect their environment. So I think while businesses are getting better, the bad guys are just, getting that much smarter, that much quicker, that much more effective.
Fascinating. Yeah, we've seen that too. No matter what organizations do, there's always a risk and a threat. And so we'll dig into a little bit more of that today as we do that. The second one I wanted to bring to you, which I thought was fascinating, and again, I've been in this industry not quite as long as you, but certainly around it enough to understand, conceptually how these things happen. I think you're coming to our security summit this year. And last year we had Kevin Mitnick, the world's most famous hacker and chief hacking officer at KnowBe4. He did a demo for a lot of our clients and guests that were with us that weekend around weaponized USB. And so there's this new essentially hack or exploit called ThunderSpy. Eindhoven University out of the Netherlands actually brought this to awareness, which is great that they did that. But what we've seen now is organizations being challenged with literally physical injections of code off these weaponized cables and different things. And so I was just wondering, as I read that, I was kind of thinking why that made the front page with everybody working from home, right, and kind of under their own lock and key, probably less espionage in the physical capacity, with the cleaning crews not maybe coming on. Do you feel like this is less of a threat or irrelevant at this point, and organizations should focus less on really physical security and more on the true virtual side?
No, I think definitely is a threat. While these weaponized cables are more likely to find them, laying around in an airport or a cyber cafe or a Starbucks where people will utilize them, the technology is still entirely valid. Actually, just 2 months ago, the FBI reported that people were mailing out USB drives that looked official, looked like came from the U.S. Postal Service, and on them had very sophisticated malware. So it's still low-hanging fruit when it comes to what bad guys can do. And I think also because of the environment we're in this day and age where so many people are working from home, they're also distanced from all the perimeter security and all the corporate security investments they had. So that kind of puts them a little off guard, and I think they don't think about things as much. So if you were to get a USB key in the mail from somebody, it looked legitimate, there's a good chance you probably would use it. And if your system is not plugged into the corporate network and doesn't perhaps have sophisticated USB controls, you may plug it in, and you may think that you're doing something useful for the organization or be efficient for your work, but in fact you're injecting a key log into your system. So I think this new remote work state we have, has let a lot of people off their guard. And this is actually probably why you see this huge, dearth of attacks, because the bad guys know this. And so they see an opportunity and they're looking to exploit it any way they can.
Yep, we've seen that, the millennials or the Generation Z and these workers were more likely to utilize those kind of the freebie things. And again, I think really one of the big areas we do practice on is just organizational awareness, right? And making sure that organizations have, a regimented, approach to this sort of technology. And I think it's something that a lot of organizations do very well, and some just check the box and don't take it seriously. So good information there. And then one that is, and I'm not a lawyer, and everybody that knows me is thankful for that. But almost in a fiduciary response, right? The New York Attorney General reached an agreement with Zoom to provide, security protections for over 300 million platform users. That they've had some challenges. There's been other organizations that have had challenges, but it really is just back to basic netiquette, right? We did a podcast on that a couple of weeks ago, how to employ some of these securities, 2FA, right? Locking your personal meeting rooms. We know some folks that are teachers that have had people come on and just use profane language, in the middle of a curriculum being delivered to children and those sorts of things. And so what we've seen is organizations almost, in a frantic or frenzy, right, trying to adopt these new SaaS tools for collaboration and many others, but they're not really reading the fine print, right? They're skipping over the security. So what obligations do organizations have, right? So if you take a 500-person organization, clearly they don't have the legal team that a Zoom or a Cisco or a Microsoft has. What feedback would you give organizations? Like what fine print in that 600-page contract that they're signing that nobody ever reads should they actually be looking for?
That's a great question. I think, when you sign up for these things, especially when you're under pressure, and which everybody is these days, which is why everybody is doing this, I think it's important to talk about, what protections they have in place to protect your data. What are they doing with the information they're collecting? Because a lot of times, your activities are just being spooled up, for their future marketing or future sales research. But at the same time, what are some SLAs? If you have an issue, who will you call and when can you expect some sort of support? Especially if you have a situation where, somebody has reached your platform and they're doing malicious things with it, or if you have some serious concerns about the configuration, what kind of support do you have for that? And so I think, especially with like the Zoom and the big rush to a lot of this online collaboration, they're just asking their friends, they're installing it. But as you mentioned, like they don't know if there's a problem, who to call, when can you expect service support, when you can expect there's a whole slew of things they don't understand that I think are really important to ensure that you're not taken advantage of and that your investments are putting in the proper place. Because if you jump to one platform, you're kind of committed at that point in time. You're really jumping off the deep end. It's very hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube and roll out a new parallel solution. So it's best to get it done right the first time.
Gotcha. Well, good feedback. We've seen, again, it's just been amazing. No matter what organization the size that they are, we've seen everybody kind of struggle, and we've been doing a lot in the adoption space to help organizations roll that out. Whether it's 2FA, whether it's collaboration tools, regardless of the platforms, it's something that's really spiked in our business, and so we've been excited about being able to make an impact and serve our customers there. But it's always interesting to me. How many organizations just kind of assume that the provider has their best interest in mind, and generally they don't, in all honesty. So, well, great. Well, again, let's get into some of the meat of what we're going to talk about today. Sam runs a tight ship and keeps me on my toes from a time perspective, and we've got quite a few people on the show today, and so I know they didn't come here to hear the current events and wanted to keep that portion still relevant to them, but essentially. What I wanted to challenge you with, Bob, again, is really two main areas. So the first one I want to start with is just technology risk. And so my experience at Katalyst and my teams in particular, we go into many organizations and help them, kind of start this journey and really express, organizationally what's important or what should be important to any organization. And so one of the things that I see organizations continue to struggle with is how technologists manage up the stack, right? And that up the stack could be, even into the C-suite, right, or to the board of directors. Many times they have to report risk in different areas and those sorts of things. And sometimes I see, these guys don't speak our language. They don't understand these sorts of things. So what feedback do you have if you're an organization? And again, we have a broad audience on today. Some may be very mature in this. Some may be quite pedestrian. But what feedback do you have for our listeners today around how to get started with a program like this? And the program I'm specifically referencing is, how do you report IT risk? Obviously, you can be audited and assessed, right? But nobody, typically puts the consultancy in front of these guys, right? So they want to maintain that control. They're sometimes fearful of their jobs and those sorts of things. So what do you suggest organizations use, Bob, to get started with a risk report for any company?
Right. I think the first thing is, don't be afraid of risk. Risk is very important because it essentially is the foundation for all the security that we have. And so I think when a lot of people kind of keep it in that framework, risk equals security, and security, helps offset risk. By coming from that element where, a good risk assessment or just risk in general helps kind of make the organization actionable, it enables them to have a conversation a lot easier. So if I'm a technologist and I want to talk to senior management, then I'm going to say, okay, here's the risk we have, and here is how it impacts our line of business or our data or our clients. So the whole thing is framing it in the context that's relevant to the senior executive. And then if I go to the board, I talk about risk and say, okay, here's how these risks impact operations, the bottom line, reputation. So there's a different slant. It's kind of like how to explain, wine to a connoisseur versus wine to your grandpa who just, drinks beer all the time. There's different approach to different things, but the key is, actionable is, and then relevant to who you're talking to. But, the concept primarily is, don't be afraid of saying, okay, here's what risk can do for you, and here's also what risk can do to you. if you don't take actions or whatnot. And so I think that putting that kind of framework in context is really the key all the way up the chain. And then it's the same way down when executives need to talk to the technologists or need to report or describe things. It's important to say, this is why we're doing this, because there's a fiduciary responsibility because we have a regulatory framework, or there's a reputational risk because if we don't get this right, everybody's going to go to company XYZ.
Sure.
So it kind of goes both ways, but I think putting in a framework that people can understand definitely helps a lot.
Great. And is that just sort of like an organizational risk scorecard? What does that actually look like? So if I'm the CISO for an organization, right, what am I sharing with an organization? Can you give us just kind of a visual of that virtually here today?
Yeah, so if you think about like columns, so the left column is going to be the big picture items, and the middle column is going to be the operational elements, and the right column is going to be all the bits and bytes and bobs and levers and whatnot. So as you move up, you just move up one frame. So the technologist talking to the manager is going to take his, detailed things about, the firewall logs. He's going to take it to senior management and say, we're not getting enough firewall logs. They're not actionable, or it's not reporting properly. Here's why we need to fix it, because we can't detect something within an SLA that's required by our framework. Therefore, we have a fiduciary responsibility. And then that manager goes, okay, we have a fiduciary responsibility. I need to bring it to the board, and says, we need to meet these obligations. Otherwise, it gets slammed in examination, and there may be some financial penalties. So that's the same concept from junior guy to executive to board, and it works backwards as well.
Gotcha. Okay, good to know. And that's part of the quantifying, right? Because again, sometimes we've seen IT try to elevate, minuscule risks, right, to the board that those guys just aren't relevant in, and don't really even appreciate why they would care about that. And I think, it's kind of ends up being a don't shoot the messenger kind of thing. But just that language and vocabulary that people use, I think sometimes is often the reason why they don't get support, and really just raise the appropriate awareness. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about BC from a security perspective. So lots of the organizations that we support, and I'm sure you as well, have a robust plan. Some, again, are in the early stages of that. Some have a plan, they haven't dusted it off, right? It's literally in a run book, in a notebook, in the safe, in the vault, whatever the case may be. The advent of cloud, they can't physically go touch things. How does risk, really fall into, a BC environment these days?
Well, business continuity is all designed about, keeping your business running effectively, be it, high availability on your servers, RAID drives at the more technical level, cloud backups, et cetera, et cetera. And these all should be kind of guided by risk, so if you're going to, make high, investments in technology, for business continuity purposes, it's important to know why you're doing that. And then under what circumstances. That's where the risk can kind of help. So let's say, for example, if you're in a earthquake-prone area, then your risk assessment is definitely going to flag highly. There's a high chance that you may have a regional earthquake that can take out services. Therefore, you have a high risk. And then at the same time, that risk will say, maybe that your backup data center shouldn't be down the street. Maybe it should be one state over, one geography away. And so it kind of helps quantify a lot of these things. We see a lot of people who think business continuity means that, server X goes down, server Y immediately kicks up. So they invest a lot of money in the technology to make this happen, but they haven't really figured out what the risk, like why would X go down to make Y turn on? What are the risks? What are the circumstances? And that can help, channel into what technologies you use. Are you using real-time backups? Are you using just static backups? Are you using a plethora of different solutions? But by knowing exactly what you're trying to prevent against, make sure that your business continuity investments are in the right place so that they'll work when you need to.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense to me, and I'm sure we'll have some questions about furthering that as well. And then the last thing that I just wanted to talk about kind of in the risk category today with you is we get audited all the time, right, from our clients, and they send us questionnaires, right, and they send us different things because we do integrate with their teams, or we are actively working in environments that are governed by PCI or high trust or whatever the case may be. And so what, where, first question is, where does this start, right, or pick up, right? So obviously, you can't build a third-party risk program without having a basic governance and kind of risk body. So after you get some of these things established and in practice quarter over quarter, share a little bit about what organizations should be looking at. So I know we get inspected of, what are we running on our endpoints for, malware protection, all the 2FA, stuff. What is our employee retention? It gets down to a contractual, language thing, right? That our COO signs and says, Katalyst, is not liable for this or is for that, and all that kind of stuff. And again, thankful that that's not my role in the organization. But what are some basic frameworks? Because I feel like, again, back to the SaaS, too many times organizations just extend trust into the partner world, ourselves included, and I'm sure you fall into that category. So what should businesses be looking at that is specific to, hey, I've got these people coming in via VPN. Sure, they're providing critical service, but how do I check, who watches the watchman sort of concept?
Right. Yeah. And so it definitely goes to two things. So one is have a full understanding of what they do. And that's really, as you mentioned, an established risk program helps that. So by knowing, how are they coming in? What's the risk to that? What data are they touching? What is the risk to that? What are they modifying? What's the risk to that? And then having an understanding of how their environment functions to make sure that the data and the connection is secure and supported appropriately. And then, even for clients that don't have a persistent environment, like what are they doing for you? How are they controlling the data? What controls are available? So it needs to have all those documented and risks outlined. But at the same time, what additional controls do they have in place? What are the SLAs? Because you want to make sure that, oh, okay, I fully understand what they're doing when they're coming in, but now how do they protect it? And then what documentation can I get to validate that? So you want like a SOC report, an assessment, or even do your own queries and provide a list of things that you want validation from. Like, oh, I need to see a copy of some of your event logs, or I need to know what SIM you're using, or like, okay, you have 5 guys in your help desk. What are their certifications? Or did you just hire them off the street because they're your buddies' pals?
Right.
So
right.
I think it's just knowing what they're doing, what you're trying to protect. And so you want to make sure you have a good understanding of how they're touching your data and how it impacts things, but also validation of all the things they're doing to make sure it's protected. Because you can't just, as you mentioned, go through the huge document and check at the bottom. Like nobody reads the end user license agreement for their Apple updates. Just nobody does. They can put anything in there. And so when you get a contract that's 146,000 pages, now it's time to roll up your sleeves and validate it. And the question is, it used to be, what have you done for me lately? But it's more like, what can you do to validate your services are actually doing what they're supposed to and protecting my environment? And then, start documenting and take it from there.
Yeah, I saw, this week, and it didn't make our current events reel today, right? But Cognizant had malware, and they're a managed service provider, right? And they reported in their earnings to Wall Street this week or last week that it was expected to cost them $50 to $70 million, right, in client protection in different programs. And we've had many healthcare organizations that have called us and said, hey, we've had a device that's been stolen, it wasn't encrypted, all those sorts of things. So there's definitely a financial penalty, even in the service provider space. I know we probably have great displeasure in filling all those out every year or quarter or whatever the cadence is, but it is a necessary thing. And I think something that lots of organizations, again, they just trust the application service provider that's giving them, critical support to their business to validate that they are secure. And I think many people skip that step. So that's good feedback. And I think, one that, people should take seriously. All right, let's shift gears a little bit over into the cybersec and really privacy space. And these are some different areas that I see organizations struggling. Obviously, we talked about, quantifying IT risk. Cybersecurity risk is in a whole different category. Baselining the current maturity of those, cybersecurity and privacy programs, that's a hard thing to do, right? What does good look like? How do we measure that? I'd like to talk a little bit around how do you provide assurance to senior management? We do know some unfortunate situations where people have been removed from organizations because of different events or breaches and that sort of thing. And then really the last piece that I still see as the number one threat vector, at least in the clients that we serve, is this business email and kind of compromise and that sort of thing. So right. Let's just talk a little bit about really bullet 2. I feel like we may have covered that, based on our conversation, bullet 1, but let's talk a little bit about, let's say you don't have a framework to follow, if you're not using CIS or NIST, or you don't have a QSA coming in from a regulatory body like a PCI or HIPAA or whatever. What should organizations be doing to just kind of baseline the maturity of their model if they're just getting started, let's say?
Right. I mean, so, you don't need to have a major framework or, a consultancy to come in to get you going on this. It's really just kind of 2 questions. Where are you at? Where do you want to be? And so we talk about your maturity, you want to start mapping out everything you have. So, much like your application inventory or hardware inventory, the same thing. What security controls do you have in place to support your business operations? Okay. And then outline those, start quantifying what they're doing for you. Like, okay, we have phishing, email protection in place. How good is it? Is it, what is it doing? You try and kind of read it, and then you're like, what do we want it to do? Like, I want it to filter out attachments. I want it to put all the links in the sandbox. And that kind of is where you want to be. And so every piece of technology along the way, you evaluate it. So, okay, we have, network access controls in place. But what I really want is something that alerts me if I do this and this and this. And then you put that Sure. on the bucket. And then, of course, if you're in a framework or in a regulatory compliancy, situation, then a lot of these are kind of already established because they'll have a baseline. So you can say, okay, where am I at? And then where is that in relative to the baseline? And then where do I want to be down the line? But even if you're just average Joe Schmo who wants to actually have a secure environment, you can take any of those controls, and they're fairly easy to find. And you can say, okay, where am I at relative to a security baseline that I think is comfortable for me? And then move my progression along the way. Where do I want to be in 3 years? Make a roadmap and start mapping along the way.
Gotcha. Okay. That's interesting. I think one of the other areas we see lots of folks struggle with is kind of stitching this story together, right? And making sure that senior management does understand what that looks like. So can you just share some experiences, obviously, in a generic fashion where you've helped organizations kind of formalize that? And again, just a few minutes on that, because I feel like lots of people don't even know what that engagement looks like, right? We get conversations all the time. And for us, in many instances, the reason we do engage you is because we have implemented the solution ourselves with our engineering talent, and we do not feel, that it's ethically proper, nor does the industry, to inspect our own, right? We do not have a delineation between implementation and kind of inspection. And so can you talk a little bit about that, Bob?
Sure. As you mentioned before, the really key is the senior management has to have full buy-in. So it kind of starts with them. And it starts with understanding how the business operates. So what are their concerns? What are they trying to protect? And then at the same time, where do they want to be? How are they growing? And that kind of sets the framework of the foundation. So once you have that conversation, okay, what do you do? What are you trying to protect? Where are you going to be in 3 to 5 years? How does your organization, how is it shifting? And then how are you having technology to support this move, or are you? Then that kind of breaks things down to have the discussion. And in general, actually comes pretty natural once you talk about how the business functions, because remember the whole framework we talked about before, all the conversations are framed in how the business functions, what is in their silo. And at that point, you start breaking things down. So if you talk to, for example, the HR group, HR is growing, leaps and bounds. We hired 5 more people. We're going to be a staff of 50. We're doing all these things. Great. Okay, well, what do you have supporting right now? Oh, we have this old compact server over here. It's held together by 3 hamster wheels in a Tesla machine. where do you want to be? Oh, we need to be able to work globally in a secure situation. And so that goes on the roadmap. And then you try and plan the move along the way. But each business unit interlocks with every other business unit. And so the concept is have a general discussion, know how they operate and what they want to do and what they're protecting, and then everything kind of trickles down from there. So it feels complex, but it's just, it's like having a lengthy conversation about, their favorite child, and, it just flows from there.
Sure. So that's really IT's responsibility to go out and begin interviewing different lines of business leaders, right, and understanding what's important to them, right? I know in a lot of the technical business canvases that we provide, we do interview, or our analysis and roadmap, right, different lines of business to understand what's important to them and how the business is impacted if they don't have that. Okay, well that's good to know, Bob, and I appreciate your feedback there. Let's talk about really the elephant in the room, at least on this slide. We continue to see and continue to, just in the last month, Katalyst, Carolina's based firm, has been engaged with, 2 different entities to help remediate an incident where they have had mass, data loss, lockup, all those sorts of things. And we were able to help with that. And I know we engaged you on 1 or 2 of those as well. But let's talk a little bit about what are some of the trends you've seen specifically, in the business email compromise space, as well as the phishing world.
Right, it is not going away. We're seeing more of them. My forensics colleagues are busy 24/7. It's just a nonstop element. Primarily, as we've mentioned before, the bad guys see an opportunity here, and so we're seeing a lot of business email compromise attacks. But more disturbingly, we're seeing a lot of business email compromise attacks that have been detected in their own email system via account takeover. So they'll get an email from a vendor saying, this seems unusual. Joe normally doesn't contact me about these things. And they look up, and then somebody's compromised Joe's account. And they're reaching out to the vendors to change information. And then while everybody's like, oh, this is so bad, the understanding, though, is most business email compromise attacks, there's a huge financial loss. Sometimes it's millions. But in general, what happens frequently is somebody tricks somebody into paying a bill or an invoice, and so what happens is you've sent that invoice to someplace in Botswana as opposed to Kentucky. That's lost. You'll never get that money back. But that other vendor still wants their money, and so that's not uncommon to be lawsuits involved. Now, if the other vendor is perhaps the source, then it gets even more detailed. And so what we're seeing is these business email compromise attacks aren't just in isolation. They're amongst clusters of organizations, because somebody will have their email account compromised, and then that person's in the accounts payable group. And so they're reading all of the accounts payable information and then sending out modified invoices to all of their vendors. And what happens, of course, is if you're one of the vendors, you get a legitimate email from Joe, and you pay it. And so it's not a spoofed email address. It looks legit, and it's probably even their documents that have just been modified with new routing information.
Sure.
So, and that's what we're seeing more of. So it's not just this isolated element where Judy in accounting is inadvertently send her payroll off to someplace else. It's this complex interweaving of organizations, and of course lawsuits associated with that, because if Joe is your guy and he's been compromised, and we have 15 of your vendors who also been compromised, you're going to get sued in some capacity, or at least your premiums for your cyber insurance are probably going to go up.
Right.
Yeah, and so they're stuck either way.
Sure. Well, good. That's a good summary. So that kind of takes us to our really my last question for you, and this is something where I've seen lots of organizations again engage us at various times, but let's say that you have that, right? You get a call from one of your supply chain folks or somebody outside your organization that says, Bob, I just got an email, right? It doesn't seem like it's legit. Why would you want to change your routing number, sort of thing? And then that leads to wow, we have an epiphany, right? We realize that we have been compromised. What is it? What are the first things that organizations should do if that happens? And so again, remembering your audience is broad here, let's start from a sub 500 organization. Like, Do they call the FBI? What if they don't have a run book? Do they call the Department of Homeland Security? I mean, what do they do? Let's just talk through some scenarios. Let's say that exact thing happened, right? What are organizations supposed to do?
Right. The first thing is take a very deep breath, because typically when they get that phone call, they completely wig out, and then you have email blasts to everybody, and everybody gets involved, and you have immediately too many chefs in the environment. So first thing is deep breath. And the second thing is get as much data as possible. Like, who just called me? What time? What do they see? Can I get a copy of that? Establish a quick timeline of possibilities, and then pull in your resources. So do you have an IT staff? Okay, pull them in. Do you have a third-party vendor for security? Okay, pick up that phone, get the phone call. But you don't need to contact the FBI or Homeland Security or Secret Service or Delta Force at this point in time. You need to gather information and figure out what's going on. And because you need to have situational awareness, because it could be that email that came through was truly a spoofed account and you're not really been hacked. But if it is, and you've done some quick research and like, oh yeah, Joe in accounting, that looks like his email. Then of course you can call any forensic resources you have available. Then you determine what's been impacted. Is it just our mail system? Is it our accounting system? Like, what's the scope we're looking at? And then of course, remember, investigations involve, information gathering. So you want to preserve information. So don't delete anything. Don't unplug systems that are doing weird, because you want to gather the information where possible. At that point, you gather information, you talk to your staff, you take action as you see it. So maybe changing passwords, it may be, taking machines off the network, but not restarting them. So you can do forensics as necessary. But once you have an idea, then you can figure out what's the scope, and then you can figure out, okay, do we need to call the local police department, file a report? Do we need to call the FBI? The reality is the FBI doesn't really get involved unless there is a significant dollar amount involved. But a lot of times, for insurance purposes, you may need a case ID number from your local police department. So once you have the scope and a timeline, then you can make those decisions, and you could take somebody who's not currently fixing your problem and go, okay, Ed, write this down, call this person, get a police report filed. And then meanwhile, my staff is going to work on, remediation and returning my environment to a secure state. And then my other group is working on forensics and root cause analysis. And then once you're back in a secure state, then you could, go through the report, inform anybody. Hopefully it's not going to be a situation where the 60 Minutes crew rolls into your your driveway.
Front page.
But, it's important. Yeah, it's important to have those steps at least outlined. Now, if you have an incident response plan, it's going to have a lot of details around this and what to do. But if you don't, the first important thing is deep breath. We're all in this together. There are resources available, but just don't freak out, and just be diligent about who you're pulling in and assigning what tasks they need to get done.
Sure. Always an important point when, it's not so much the know-how at this point, it's the know what, right? And I feel like a lot of people, they just get into this situation and they panic and they make rash decisions. And that leads to challenges long-term, and that sometimes is critical to understanding how these things, happened and that sort of stuff. Because again, these opportunities present themselves and should make you stronger. It's unfortunate that they happen, but it's not a matter of if, right? It's a matter of when. No matter what budget you put into it, right? A lot of it comes back to, again, educating your users and making sure they're aware of these things. So, Bob, I've learned a tremendous amount today. We've got some questions that have come in. I know we're running over on time, and we're not going to have the opportunity to answer those today. But any closing thoughts, that you have for the audience today, specific around, any of the things that we've talked about, or things that you want to go back on or reiterate? Or really, the other question I'd love to ask my guests are, if you're at the backyard barbecue, right, and you want to impress on somebody the top 3 things you should be doing in the cybersecurity world today, what are those things? So you can answer any one of those 3 questions, but just like to get some final thoughts from you.
Right. So I'll take the barbecue question. I think the first one is, risk is the fundamental element of all security. So if you haven't done a risk assessment, then all your security investments are completely worthless. Because you don't know really where you're protecting. If the barbarians are attacking your horde, you know where they're coming from.
Right.
And the second thing is, you don't have to be in a regulated environment to have a secure state. It's important to know what you're protecting and how you want to make sure that it's protected. So you don't have to have the FDIC saying you need to do X, Y, and Z. Any organization can make investments in protecting their environment to make sure that, their data and their clients' data are protected. And the last one is just when you put all these things together in an organization, what is your audience, as you mentioned before, and then make sure the language you're talking to them is relevant to what they understand. So we talk risk, we talk security, at the board level or the senior level or the technical level, that's relevant to those audiences to ensure that they understand and get buy-in.
Great to know. And there you have it, folks, the top 3 from an expert himself. Bob, the only thing I did want to clarify, a barbecue in the Twin Cities is something you go to, right? Down here in the Carolinas, a barbecue is something you eat, and it's a pulled pig. If you've never been to one of those, the next time you come down, we will fire one up for you and make sure that you can experience that. But that is just a big, kind of geographical disparity there. But I appreciate you coming on the show today. It's always great to catch up with you. Thanks for the hard work that you guys do with us here at Katalyst. And Sam, I'll turn it over to you if there's anything else you want to cover. We do have, again, this is certainly turning into something that we've tried to be consistent with and have gotten a lot of great feedback from our clients. So if you guys have topics or ideas that you want us to talk about or bring on an expert, again, we're going to be zeroing in on some alerting and kind of alert fatigue and how to solve some of those things in the future, as well as some more cultural issues around technology and security that we see organizations struggle with. But to the audience out there, if you guys do have things that you'd like to see us entertain or pull in a resource for, we're happy to do that, and hope you guys enjoyed the show today. And thank you very much for joining. Thanks again, Bob. Be safe.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.